Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. So this is just a brief outline of what I'm going to go over today. So first, I'm going to talk about Earnest and what we do. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we model credit decisions at Earnest. I'll touch very briefly on the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So in the description, I mistakenly listed the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is my fault. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about this guy. Just wanted to clarify. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how we use ensemble methods to sort of satisfy the requirements from the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Right, so Earnest is an online lender. We were founded in 2013. We mostly do personal loans and student loan refinances. One of the key differentiators about Earnest is we collect data from many sources. Right, so first we get the full credit report from one of the credit reporting agencies, so like Equifax or Experian, TransUnion, those guys. But we also get transactional financial data. So when an applicant applies, we can see all their transaction history going back. And this is from companies like Intuit or Yodlee. So if you're familiar with those companies, that's the type of data that we're getting. As far as I know, we're the only company out there that has access to both of these data sources at the same time for like the same persons, right? And so one thing unique about Earnest is we try to we really want to emphasize using technology and data to make better lending decisions, right? So we're collecting all this data, and it doesn't make any sense if we're not going to use it to do anything, right? So one of the first things we tried to do, and an example of trying to emphasize technology, is we tried to automate our underwriting process through modeling. And so what we wanted to do was sort of build models that would replicate what our underwriters were deciding for loans, right? So our original plan of action was, very simply, we gather the data, right? So this would be both the applicant credit characteristics, but also the outcome of the decision, so like whether or not we approve the loan. Then we sort of curate some features around these characteristics, and then we train a yes or no model on the outcomes. Right, and so none of these steps is particularly hard, right? Like your data might be poorly organized or like not structured well, so it might take you longer to gather everything. You might spend a long time like curating, the world's best features, right? You might spend some time there, but the actual modeling is relatively straightforward, right? So our underwriters are humans, and human brains just aren't wired to process that much information at the same time, right? Models, on the other hand, are very powerful, right? If you give them more information, they'll do much better, right? And so our sort of initial approach here was just engineer a bunch of features and like throw it at your favorite algorithm, right? So this is not a hard problem, right? You come up with what, like 200 features. This is a 0-1 outcome. They solved this problem in like the 80s, right? We're not putting this on Kaggle. So this is an example of our results from like doing this model, right? So I went through that process, and we built a random forest. This is the RLC curve on, these are out of sample predictions, right? So this curve is really steep, right? This model's great. Area under curve of 0.9479, right? But it turns out we're not quite done, right? So it turns out that lending is a very highly regulated industry. And these are a few of the laws that all lenders are subject to, whether online or like in person. Whenever I see a list like this with like usury laws on it, I always think to myself like, oh, stupid people in the 30s always ruining things for the rest of us, right? So this stuff is like, fun to joke about, but it's actually really serious stuff, right? These things sound ridiculous to us today, but that's because these laws exist and like institutions have been following them for so long. So the main law that I'm going to talk about is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So this law was enacted in 1974 to prevent discrimination in lending. So it explicitly prohibits certain information from being collected at all during the application, right? So we're not allowed to ask whether or not you're married or if you have children or are planning to have children. It also prohibits specific attributes from being considered at all, right? So we can't use race or gender or age in the when we make our decisions for whether or not to approve you for your loan. And this last part, which is sort of the most relevant one, this act requires the lender or creditor to give specific reasons why an application was rejected, right? And so this is to provide transparency to make sure everyone's following the top two rules, right? So if we sort of go back to our original model, right, this is sort of not enough anymore, right? We also have to be able to, given all the people that we decline, we have to tell them why, right? And so stepping back for a little bit, right, all of these machine learning methods that we're familiar with, like random forests, which we used here, gradient boosting machines or neural nets, these are all very powerful methods, but I'm sure you guys are really familiar. They're also very opaque, right? And so here we've built this random forest, and I've tuned the crap out of it. It does great. But given this new requirement, how do I back out the decline reasons for anyone that the model says to decline? And so you might be tempted to look at the importances, right? And you can try to make some guesses on why someone gets declined, right? So if we say, I apply for a loan, I get declined, and we sort of look at this stuff your credit report isn't good, right? I just want to point out that I've sort of masked the variable names because I don't want to reveal any of our secret sauce, but I swear this is real. This is a real thing. Right? So you can try to guess stuff based on these importances, but at that point you might as well be doing this. This is one of my favorite photos. It comes up a lot at work. I realize this is a stock photo. So if the author is out there, I swear if this thing takes off, I'll buy this photo off of you. But until then, thank you for the free photo. So what are some other approaches, right? So a traditional institution would try to dial everything back, right? So they limit the variables that you look at or restrict the types of models that you consider building. And you almost always end up with some silly risk scorecard. So if any of you guys are familiar with working in finance, I'm sure you've seen something like this, right? So your risk score is equal to your FICO plus your income plus your assets, and then they ding you a little bit for your debt, right? And then if your risk score is high, they give you your loan, and then if it's low, then they decline you. And then because, this thing is so simple and the variables are very easy to understand, right? It's very easy to back out the decline reason, right? So if you get declined and your FICO is too low, they tell you your credit history isn't very good, right? If you get declined and your debt is too high, they tell you you have too high of debt, right? And if your income is too low, they tell you something like, your cash flow is low. So we found this very unsatisfactory, right? We weren't gaining anything if we just settle on a model like this. And so, if we go back to our original plan and think about how we went about building our models, right? The actual decline reason data, that stuff exists, right? The law, we're abiding by, we're collecting all that data. For every loan that our underwriters were declining, they were also selecting these decline reasons. But in that original plan, we never actually incorporated any of that data into our model building, right? And so we wanted to come up with a way to incorporate it into the process. And the way that we settled on was, instead of building this this large model for yes or no outcome, right? Instead, we build a bunch of much smaller models, right? One for each decline reason, and the model is sort of predicting whether or not this decline reason can be applied to the loan, right? And then once we have these small individual models, we can take an ensemble out of all of them to predict the final yes or no, right? And so what we're doing here is we're sort of imposing a bit of structure, not a lot, but a bit to gain a bit of transparency into the actual, like what the model is doing. So this is how it looks like in pictures. On the left here, we have all the stuff that we're collecting. In the middle, these are sort of individual models, right? So there's a model for high debt. There's another one for like missed payments, right? And these produce like a 0, 1, right? And then on the far right, we take an ensemble out of all of them to sort of make the final decision. I wanted to talk very briefly about ensemble methods. So in general, there's sort of two paradigms when it comes to ensemble methods. The one everyone's most familiar with is taking a bunch of weak learners, right, and then getting a strong learner out of it. So all these things like random forests or ADA boost or boosting machines, right, they take very weak like decision trees, right? So in ADA boost, if your tree only has one node, it's called like a stump, right? And the collective of all your trees, right, that gives you a really strong model, right? So the other paradigm is you take a few mediocre learners and then you can get a strong learner out of them. And that's sort of the approach that we've taken back here, right? So each of these models in the middle is sort of, it's an average, it's an okay model for whether or not we're going to decline the loan, right? So not every loan with low assets gets declined. Some of them get approved. But when we look at all of them in aggregate, we can make really good decisions. So I ended up building random forests for the individual decline reason models. It turns out you can build anything. I just had all that stuff set up. So on the left here, these are the importances from our forest for predicting low savings, right? And then if you look at the top 4 features, these are all based on their account balances. On the right, we have the importances from our model for predicting if someone is in collections, and everything's based on the credit report. This is the same stuff. This one on the left, it's high debt to income ratio. The top 2 are related to income. The middle 4, or the next 4, are all related to the amount of monthly payments that the borrower is making, right? So the next 4, like the first 2 is the income, which is your denominator, and then the other 4 are the numerator, right? Your debt. On the right is sort of one of my favorites. So this is high debt. Most of the credit report related stuff is related to account balances. The 2 really cool ones are the transaction ones in the middle. And those are related to whether or not the borrower is getting assessed interest charges every month, right? So whether or not we're able to tell if they're actually like paying off their credit card every month or if they're holding a balance. To do the ensemble step, I used a GLM to model the final decisions given the outputs from the individual models. I picked the GLM because it's simple and also because it's really easy to back out the decline reasons, right? So what we can do is we can use the effect size, right? So it's just the slope from our GLM multiplied by the score from our model, and then we pick reasons based on the highest ones, and then maybe apply a bit of like thresholding and business logic to make sure we're only picking relevant reasons. This is an example of doing the effect size math, which is just multiplying. The second column is the slopes that we estimated in our GLM. The third column is the output from our individual decline reason models and the effects on the right. And then we take any effect that's larger than 0.2, right? So for this person, we decline them. We would tell them they have low assets and high debt to income. So this is the ROC curve for our ensemble model. That's the thing in gray and black. The red line is the ROC curve from our original. So every time I see this, I always get very, I I feel really good about myself. But we lost very little signal, but we gained all this transparency. Like even the area under the curve like barely changed. Right? And the best part is this same model, or this model with ensembles, over 96% of the declined loans, we were able to correctly identify a decline reason. Right? And we didn't have to restrict any of the features that we can consider. We could have built any model that we wanted. I just picked random forest because we had that set up. But we can build any, like, you can throw your favorite thing. And we didn't lose very much accuracy. So that's all I have today. Any questions?
So, meaning, do you really have a minimum set of data science?
Sure. So the question was, in my data sources, do I check if they're correlated with each other, like if I'm using the minimum set? So before this step, like before the stuff you see here, we did a bit of feature selection to prune out the stuff. So for the most part, after pruning, they're reasonably uncorrelated. That's another question.
I was just curious. So these are formerly rejected loans versus actual defaults, or what was that originated?
So the data that we use to train the models is what our humans were deciding, okay. Like what decisions they made. Yeah.
You mentioned GLM.
Yeah.
So do we generalize that in the model?
So the question was what I meant by GLM on this slide. Yes, this is a generalized linear model. It was a logistic regression. Yeah.
One more question. We're just curious the ratio between positive samples and
So the question is, what is the ratio between positive and negative samples? I cannot tell you explicitly because that would imply like our approval rate, but they're not. It's not super skewed. It's decently balanced.
Do an example approach for each of the sub element. You actually generate yes and no values.
In
like a high-tech, high EPI, so they generate yes and no values.
Sure. So the question was for the intermediary models, whether they output a yes or no or the score, and so they actually output a probability. Yeah.
If you were using just logistic regression, looking at the coefficients of these features, what would you have?
So do you mean like if instead of using random forest here, I use logistic regression for like all of them? I remember having an intern do that. The difference wasn't super big. I think we could have. So he looked at a bunch of things. He also looked at using like gradient boosting machines, right? And the improvement was marginal. We settled on random forest because we had a lot of it built out.
How many trees in the forest?
So the question is on how many trees that we ended up using. Each of these is about 500. Yeah, just nothing special. Like they weren't like super hard, right? Like humans don't do that much.
Pretty fast.
Yeah. I guess last question.
How unbalanced is the problem and how you deal with that?
Can you repeat that?
How
Sorry.
unbalanced is the problem you try to solve? You know how many, you say like yes, you have a good report, how many now? And how you how you tackle that problem?
So the question was on how unbalanced was the data and how I solved that. The data was pretty balanced for the most part. That actually went into like how we settled on these reasons. So it turns out our underwriters pick like, they have like 20 reasons to choose from. We settled on the 9 most popular ones, and those 9 were not super skewed or anyway. Yeah. I think I'm out of time, so thank you.